Hey everyone, it's Vinita. Welcome back to Season 8 of Don't Call Me Resilient. This season, we have a little bit of a different format for the podcast. We've taken the show on the road. We're recording live episodes with audiences across Canada, and we're bringing some of those conversations to you here on our feed. The conversation you're about to hear is the first in our series and was originally recorded on November 14th, 2024 at Another Story bookshop in Toronto. This conversation took place on the same night Taylor Swift kicked off the Canadian leg of her Eras tour, and a little over a week after the U.S. elections when Donald Trump became the president-elect. You'll hear some references to those events in this conversation. And so, here we go. My name is Vinita Srivastava. I'm the host of the podcast Don't Call Me Resilient at The Conversation Canada. This is our very first live event. It's the first in our series. And one of the reasons we wanted to be out and do live events is so that we can be in a room full of people like this. So it's really wonderful to be here. And I'm really, really thrilled to be here with my good old friend, Andrea Freeman. Andrea Freeman is a professor at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles. Much of Andrea's work explores food oppression and examines how food and law policy is influenced by corporate interests and how it disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. And not just impacts, but harms marginalized communities. Her latest book, Ruin Their Crops on the Ground, The Politics of Food in the United States, From the Trail of Tears to School Lunch, looks at the history of food in the United States. And it looks at food as a weapon and as a weapon of control and conquest. And it's this new book that we're going to be diving into today. On a personal note, Andrea and I have known each other for years. We first met as university students. We helped start the United Coalition Against Racism. We were roommates first, and then we became comrades in the struggle. Andrea, I'm so glad to be speaking with you today.
Same. And I want to thank everyone for being here instead of at the Taylor Swift concert tonight. I know it must have been tough, but maybe it was easier to get tickets to this. I don't know. Yeah. So no, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with my brilliant friend, Vinita, who has been inspiring me for, I don't want to say how many years. Okay. A lot. And I'm just thrilled to talk about the book.
Okay, so shall we just dive into it then? So there's so much to talk about in this book. I want to start actually where you start, which is this first chapter called Weapons of Health Destruction. And it talks about the first settlers coming to North America. And you begin and end that chapter by talking about fry bread. You talk about this great love for fry bread. There's this pop culture love for fry bread. There's t-shirts about fry bread. There's movies about fry bread. There's songs about fry bread. And fry bread is really important to Indigenous communities. Although there is this real cultural love for it, there's also a real critique of it. So I'm wondering first, can you tell us about fry bread? Can you describe what it is and how it came to be? And then after you do that, maybe you can unwrap some of this love-hate relationship.
Absolutely. So fry bread, and if you have not tried it, please run, don't walk, because it is fantastic. It's a fried dough, and it can be savory or sweet. So you have like what's called an Indian taco, where you just put salsa and beans on top, or it can be sweet with jam. It's so delicious. And it has interesting history, but people don't agree on what that is. Maybe the most accepted story is that when Indigenous people were imprisoned at Fort Sumner, they were given flour infested with weevils and some lard and a cooking pod. So it looked like they were going to starve, but they took the creativity and used the lard and fried the flour in it so that it would kill all of the infestations, and created this dish that ended up being so good that they continued eating it even after they left. So it transformed something that was quite oppressive and deliberately indifferent and could have meant complete disaster and starvation into something that has become this amazing tradition.
You talk about the T-shirt, like the got fry bread, so that Indigenous folks can recognize each other.
Yeah, because there are so many Indigenous nations, and it's hard for people to know who's who. And, like powwows these days are just full of a lot of different people. And so it's almost like a signal. You got the fry bread shirt, we're down kind of thing. And I talk about the movie Smoke Signals, where the main character, Thomas, is trying to be a real Indian, so he gets his fry bread shirt on. There's so many cultural references, and it is celebrated. But on the other hand, it's also, as you said, critiqued or vilified because, well, you heard what I said. It's fried bread. Like, it's not good for you. And because Indigenous health is often so poor, and when you look at rates of illnesses related to food, Indigenous people often have like the highest rates of diabetes and other health issues related to food. Outsiders will just say, well, all they eat is fry bread. They don't understand health. They don't understand nutrition. It's their own fault. Right, which completely overlooks both the history and the current realities of what there is to work with in order to, be as healthy as possible.
So there's actually like a real relationship between like the health of Indigenous communities and fry bread.
Yeah, and it's also symbolic because the same way you look at these stereotypes of Indigenous people and alcohol, which we know alcohol was introduced like these rations to harm, to hurt, to try to die off. And then these stereotypes attach. So fry bread is another kind of stereotypical food that's used to blame and to try to think about food not as a systemic problem with the way that the government treats people on reservations or the historical oppression, but just as, a personal choice. This is what they like. This is what they eat. That's their fault.
So you mentioned this idea of die off or kill off. And of course, that's connected to this idea of genocide. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit more about that. How did the U.S. government, how did that work?
So the title of the book, Ruin Their Crops on the Ground, is a paraphrase of George Washington's words and his order to his troops on how they should treat Indigenous people, ruin their crops in the ground, and prevent their planting more. So this was the military policy of the United States to starve Indigenous people. So they tried to starve them, and then they obviously this forced exile across the country to land where some of it you could work it and some of it was just nothing. Promised rations on the other end. Often those rations were spoiled meat and completely inadequate food. Those rations are still being given and called a government program called Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, which is a continuation of the rations that have always been given, but still really bad food.
We're talking about the U.S., of course. Your book is all about the U.S. history, but there's so many parallels to what you're talking about to Canada as well. We've seen very similar programs from the government.
Yeah, absolutely. And the boarding schools where food played such an important role.
Yes, the residential school system here is very similar. So I want to move on, if we could, to the next very controversial food, which is milk. And in your book, you talk about this kind of conventional message that milk was good for you.
Yeah.
And that conventional message, it's decades old. I mean,
Century.
Over a century old. But so milk is actually not good for everyone. And it's more complicated than that. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it arguably might not be good for anyone. But, I mean, what's interesting about milk boosterism and this sort of like propaganda around
When you say boosterism, you're talking about like the marketing of milk?
Yeah, I'm kind of using an old-fashioned word because I'm thinking about the beginning of the 20th century, 1908, the first person, this nutritional biologist, E.V. McCollum, who went around telling everybody how important milk was and how it was necessary to the diet. At that time, the milk industry seized on that because so many people were getting sick from milk. It was transmitting tuberculosis, hand, foot, and mouth disease. Like, it was absolutely toxic. Before it was pasteurized, it was killing like 49 out of 100 infants. But then it just spread disease instead of killing people. So basically, nobody wanted to drink it. And so these campaigns grew to try to change people's thinking about milk as something that's dangerous and dirty and disease-ridden to an essential part of the diet.
Milk was always portrayed as the wholesome American food, right?
But that wholesome is like wholesome equals white. That's how McCollum sold milk. He went around the country. So Herbert Hoover, who became president later, was director of nutrition at that time. So he heard about him. He sent him on a tour where he told audiences all across the United States, the people who drink milk are the white people who are the strongest and the smartest. And if you drink milk, you'll be like them. And this got printed, he said, like the Aryans, right? So this got then printed into all of these pamphlets that went all over the place. So from the very beginning, this association between milk and whiteness has been there. And we've seen it revived very recently.
Last, like what?
Like decade or so.
Decade, yeah, 10 years.
Yeah.
You wrote a great article about that. Can you tell us a little bit? Yeah. Tell us about that one.
Well, okay. I wrote a law review article called The Unbearable Whiteness of Milk, which is also
Whiteness of Milk, yes.
chapter in here. And then I wrote a short article for Conversation, a wonderful news site. Basically, this sort of neo-Nazi alt-right movement has seized on milk as a symbol of white supremacy. And that is this association between the whiteness of milk and white superiority. So they changed the emojis in some of their Twitter handles to a little glass of milk. And they have all these other ways to signal that they're milk, and therefore superior.
Because they can digest it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because lactose, what is called intolerance, although that's a kind of racist term because almost everybody actually does not tolerate milk.
I just want to hear that one more time.
Okay.
Lactose intolerance is kind of a racist term, you're saying?
So statistically, white people are the ones who can digest milk. And even then, it's really like Scandinavians, Northern Europeans, right? So a lot of other white people cannot.
So lactose intolerance just means everybody else.
It's everyone. But when you call it intolerance, when the norm is that you don't drink it after childhood, then you're saying, well, to be white is like the baseline. And if you're not that, you're intolerant, right? So some people use different language like lactose persistent. It's so interesting the extremes that the industry will go to try to force people to drink it, even though it makes everybody sick.
So basically, milk makes most racialized communities sick.
Yeah. And even tons of white people too. But there is a movement, there's an organization of doctors in the United States, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, that has tried very hard to get milk out of schools, especially in the public schools where, like say in LA where we live, it's like 94% are not white, but they're being forced
to drink
milk. And in the U.S., if you're a school kid and you want a milk alternative, then you have to go to a doctor and get a diagnosis that you have a disability. I mean, they just make you jump through hoops.
We took the milk off of the Canadian food guide. I think we did, and just in the last 5 years.
You're ahead of us.
You were talking about harms. Do you want to talk a little bit more about
milk?
Yeah.
Well, it's not just the lactose intolerance, which is bad, but it's something people seem to accept, or they'll take a pill.
Well, because you want to eat the pizza or...
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But hey, vegan cheese
ice cream
up in the front.
I know.
It's even better. But there's a lot of other health issues that have been linked to milk drinking.
So long-term illnesses as well. It's not just, oh, I got an upset stomach today.
No, exactly.
So you talking about this sort of, what you used that old-fashioned word you said, but the bolstering, the bolstering or something of milk. Like, how did this happen? You're talking about this machinery behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's really just the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is very invested in promoting the dairy industry. So even though people don't want to drink milk anymore and the sales have declined for like 40, 50 years, they won't give up on it. They keep this promise. So they are supporting the industry, but the people don't want to buy it. So the USDA has to take the milk, they turn it into cheese, they put it into caves. They have acres and acres of underground caves filled with cheese. They send it to other countries. They send it to poor people. They put it in schools and force kids to have it. They're just trying to dump it. The program that I mentioned for Indian reservations, commodity cheese is one of the biggest ingredient and most beloved as well. So it's sort of a similar thing to the fry bread.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And another thing where people have a very complex relationship, because if you grew up poor in the US, you got cheese. The government would drive around in trucks and throw massive blocks of cheese out the back of trucks or have a table and people would just come and get it. And so that was the treat. That was like the delicious food, right? But also associated with poverty or deep poverty. And so it's not something people like to talk about or even admit. It's such a complicated thing. So some people celebrate it. Like I write about in the book, the Wahlberg family, like Marky Mark, Mark Wahlberg, all of them, they run a burger chain and they use government cheese, right? And they talk about, oh, well, we grew up on it. We're not ashamed. We think it's great, right? Whereas people who aren't white have a sort of more, I think, desire to distance from it.
I see.
Because of the stigma. And
you're not necessarily embracing your history in that yet. Yeah. Right. So we're talking about how milk was created, the USDA, but there's also a huge marketing machine behind it. In your book, a lot of what you talk about is the harm of marketing campaigns specifically targeted towards racialized communities. And it sounds like those corporations are really connected to what you're also talking about, which is the U.S. government.
Yeah. So part of the USDA efforts to get rid of more milk was to create a marketing branch for the dairy industry and use that branch to partner with fast food companies and create products with a lot more cheese in them. So Domino's, the USDA created for Domino's a 7-cheese pizza. They partnered with Taco Bell. They made like a grilled cheese burrito that's also got cheese outside. The description is all about like the world of cheese and cheese is everything. Like if we had the visuals, y'all would be like, can we stop and eat now? Because they just make these products that look so good that are all cheese, right? And so the problem with this, beyond maybe the obvious, right, is who's eating fast food.
Right.
Because everybody eats some fast food some of the time, but some people live in neighborhoods that we call food swamps where like that's the only thing available. And these products are also now in the schools.
You call them food swamps, not food deserts.
So it's kind of like a food desert has been used, and some people don't like this term because it's like empty, desolate. That's kind of saying there's
nothing here, food desert.
Nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But a swamp there's a lot, but it's all bad. Right? So if you go to a lot of poor neighborhoods in the U.S., every second place is a fast food. So there's plenty to eat, but it's all going to make you sick. Right? And so even though white people in the U.S. eat more by volume of fast food, Black, Indigenous, Latina, and other communities eat by percentage.
more.
Like dominating the diet because that's what's cheap and that's what's accessible. So once the USDA decides that they're going to just push all this cheese into that food, which is then making people sick, and this just comes out statistically that when you look at all of the diseases and illnesses and conditions related to too much milk or too much fast food, there's racial disparities in every single one of them.
We're still talking about milk and cheese. Can you talk us through any other examples? Are there other examples of these? You call it big food, I think, right? That's not the term.
That's kind of like these big food industry, like big ag, like the way that these industries have consolidated and gained power. So in the 1930s, when it was a depression in the U.S., and then there was the New Deal, and this idea to get rid of the depression, and also to get rid of the hunger caused by the depression and boost the agricultural industry,
right?
The United States started to subsidize some foods, some crops. So they picked ones that would help people eat a lot, like kind of empty calorie. So it was like corn and soy and wheat and milk and meat. And so they put money into those industries, and then those industries grew because they were getting the subsidies and other people growing maybe more healthy stuff were not. And so as they grew, they consolidated and they gained more power. So then 20, 30 years later, instead of hunger being the major problem that's related to food in the U.S., it's nutrition, and low nutrition come from eating all this crappy food that's being subsidized. But instead of shifting to then subsidize the food that would solve that problem, they doubled down. Because these industries had gotten so big that they now control food policy in the U.S. So we see no change in the subsidies. We see these surpluses that then have to go somewhere. So the government that you think would be trying to make people healthy and solve problems is actually trying to make corporations happy and do what they want and solve their problems.
That's just because of the strong lobbies, because money and lobbies, basically.
Yes, the corporations are in complete control. And they have organizations where they will get together and write laws and then give them to states or federal Congress people and be like, put this into law. And then they become law. So anytime there's been an attempt, like with the Obama administration, to try to make school meals healthier or anything like that, the corporate pushback is so strong. It always succeeds.
You mentioned the Obama administration tried to make school lunches better. And that chapter, especially about school lunch, it really got to me. It was pretty intense because you're really talking about the future of the United States when you're talking about children.
Yeah, and you see where it's going.
Yeah. It's really,
all these malnutrition people who are now coming into power.
It's really depressing.
Well, I mean, it's true. Look at Trump. Trump's whole thing is fast food.
It's fast food.
Yeah.
Like that whole thing about how chocolate milk was removed, but then put back because Trump really wanted the chocolate milk.
Yeah. When he invited athletes to the White House, he gave them meals of fast food. And they're like, what? This is actually so racist because when other people get invited, they get banquets, they get chefs, they get nice food, and you're giving us like Big Macs because this is what you think we eat,
right?
Or,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
The other shocking thing that I read, and I probably shouldn't be shocked, but was Kraft Food owned by Philip Morris. Just the amount of corporate involvement in kids' diets and in Americans' diets, it's overwhelming almost.
Yeah, and the marketing that they do now is so insidious.
Oh yeah, tell us a little bit more about the new market. Like you talked about the 30s, but like bring us forward to what's the marketing like now?
I mean, everybody knows how kids get their information now, which is social media, right? And so they are right there.
Yeah.
Right? So first it was television and a lot of segmentation in television. If you remember the whole Nielsen data, they would like track what people are watching. And then they got technology to change commercials. So they would say, oh, this person is Latina and they love bacon. And then they'd put like bacon chalupa Taco Bell ad instead of what was supposed to be there. All that happened with TV. But now they're using social media. They're using kidfluencers. So they actually use kids to promote fast food. They do TikTok challenges. They go into video games. You could order pizza while you're playing a game as your character and not even stop playing. No. They have vending machines in games so that they can see exactly what each kid wants by what they pick out of, like, you know.
So the data
tracking is incredible. Right. Yeah. And then, you know, the use of celebrities, you know, these milk ads sponsored by the USDA, like the whole milk mustache.
Yeah, right.
Which was like a very long running ad and a lot of celebrities there. Now it's all rappers and they're just using whatever to reach the people that they want. Younger, but also Black youth who are considered to be cool. They really exploit every kind of social nuance there is.
That's really awful. I want to go back to that school lunch thing because it really was a chapter that I felt very enraged by. And the whole book, I mean, it's just like, I don't know how you've been doing this for so many years. And you must have like a real way of dealing with it. But I want to talk to you about that in a minute, about school lunches. We're talking about a program that's meant to help marginalized, low-income children.
Okay, but like I have to stop you because they were not made to help kids. They were made to help the industry. Yeah. With the surpluses, they had to go somewhere. And they had to go somewhere that would not affect the market. So they could only give food to people who would not be able to buy it otherwise. Mm. And so schools were a perfect site for that. They're not going to be able to buy it. So they just started giving commodity foods for free. And then around like the 70s, 80s, it turned around and they started saying, actually, no, schools, you pay us. And you guarantee us a certain amount. And the whole system of the federal food lunch is predicated on the schools buying the exact amount of commodities that they want them to buy. And they can't have anything outside of that. They can't take food from a garden.
You wrote in the book the story about the sitcom, the TV show, where they try and grow a garden, but...
Abbott Elementary.
Great
show. Highly recommend. Yes, the scene in the show is these teachers who are trying to put together a school garden and they think it's so lovely and then they grow something and then they take it to the school cafeteria and the cafeteria manager just dumps it straight into the garbage. Right. And then they go home and they prepare, they get more vegetables and then they bring it in and it's like, okay, we have enough to feed the whole school. Here it is, straight into the garbage because you just can't do that. There's too many rules around supposed food safety and other things that are not genuine to avoid exactly that. And I also talk in the book about my kids' school, which was Waikiki Elementary, that had a huge, gorgeous organic garden that the kids would work on, but they weren't allowed to serve in the cafeteria. And in fact, they gave it to this high-end restaurant. And then if you go to that restaurant, they tell you, oh, this harvested by young students. Now that's like, wait a second, like you should give me this for free. Like you exploited my children for this. And they can't even eat it.
Yeah, I mean, we're laughing. It's awful.
It's terrible.
It's terrible.
They put in so many rules so that you can't do anything good.
Everything we're talking about is really, really overwhelming. It's really overwhelming. It's very enraging. Taken all together, it's very intense. But I know that the legal protections, even that chapter was pretty challenging to read because you talk about how challenging the law is and how this is a basic human right. I'm wondering, why can't we get there? Like, we know that this is a basic human right. Why can't we get there?
It's too much corporate control. There is absolute capture of the U.S. government by corporations. So what I suggest in the book is a constitutional route. Now, part of this comes from I am a constitutional law professor. So I do think about that a lot. I specialize in race, and I think a lot about these amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, these kind of post-Civil War Reconstruction amendments, and what work they might be able to do. Because, I mean, I feel ridiculous even with the court we have now. Okay, so let's just say that, right? However, lower courts, okay, maybe local type of ideas. The other reason I think about constitutional principles is I think that's a way to frame this that can make people want to do something about it. Like, wait, this is unconstitutional. That is something we care about or used to care about, and that it's not okay. But another chapter in the book discusses how during the whole period of chattel slavery, enslavers used food to control people they enslaved, and how the law supported that and made it impossible for enslaved people to even grow food, sell food, fish, all of this. So that the 13th Amendment, which is intended to erase all of what's called like the vestiges or markers or badges of slavery. It works for things that began back then and are still alive today. So, for example, we have a Supreme Court case that says housing discrimination is protected by the 13th Amendment because that's something that comes right out of slavery. And so, to me, these food policies and laws that create these racial health disparities come directly from slavery and are operating in the same way today. So I think the 13th Amendment reaches that. So I think it can be used to abolish some of these policies, and especially ones where the government is requiring people to work to get food, like SNAP, which are food stamps in the United States. That's food benefit. And you now have to work to get them, which not a lot of people can do for various reasons. It's not that easy to just like get a job and work all the hours that you need to get the food. So it's that or starve. So people who are otherwise eligible and poor by no fault of their own, in fact, poor because of the political capitalist system, cannot eat. And to me, that's also a form of involuntary servitude that is not allowed under the 13th Amendment. And then the 14th Amendment is supposed to give equal protection to everyone, regardless of race, and that is clearly not happening. And so that's another thing that I talk about of a constitutional violation, because as much as a different administration, as you said, might put in some better rules for schools or this or that, it's just going to keep changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're very hopeful in many ways.
Yeah, not at all. No. I'm trying.
You're trying. Okay. All right. So there's glimmers. There's glimmers of hope.
I mean, we're here. Like everyone in this room cares something about that.
Yeah.
There are people who care.
You mentioned the local, and that's one of the things that I think it is where we kind of have to put some of our energy is it is that lower level and it is the local, because it is one of the places where we actually can make an impact. I mean, I know that you talked about not being able to make changes at the school level. In your book, you talk about a lot of communities who then like rally together to get money to help even children buy their school lunches, even then. So.
One thing that really annoys me, though, is just that people do so much of this work without getting paid.
Yeah.
Because it's always falls on the communities that are impacted and the people that care the most and put the most energy in and don't get paid for it.
Yeah.
And that's not okay. Because even if the government doesn't want to do the work, they at least should fund it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrea. Thanks for that conversation.
Thank you.
I want to do a couple of other thank yous. Ryan Clark, thank you so much for doing the sound. And also to my fellow producers, Athika Kaki and Jennifer Moroz, and to Anju and Another Story Bookshop. Thank you very much, everybody. It was a wonderful conversation. And thanks, Andrea.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Don't Call Me Resilient. Thinking back on that conversation now, I can point to so many ways that it has permeated my everyday life, since food is life. And since my lactose intolerant kid was at the recording, we often make references to Andrea's words. I'd love to hear how the conversation landed with you. You can reach us at dcmr@theconversation.com or on Instagram at Don't Call Me Resilient Podcast. And make sure you're subscribed wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Don't Call Me Resilient is a production of The Conversation Canada. The series is produced and hosted by me, Vinitha Srivastava. This episode was recorded live on site at Another Story Bookshop in Toronto, Canada, and was co-produced by our associate producer, Athika Kaki. Ryan Clark did the audio recording and mixing for this episode. Our consulting producer is Jennifer Moroz, and our student journalist this season is Marissa Sithiamorn. Zaki Ibrahim wrote and performed the music we use on the podcast. The track is Something in the Water. Something in the water.